The storm over Silverpine, Montana, cut like knives through the midnight air. Snow lashed against Deputy Ryan Callahan's cabin when a sound broke through the howling wind, a soft, desperate scratching at the door. He froze, hand hovering over the latch. On the porch stood a German shepherd mother, her fur crusted with ice, amber eyes blazing with determination. In her jaws, she carried a single puppy by the scruff of its neck, the tiny body limp, its breath a fragile thread against the -58 degrees Fahrenheit night. Ryan's heart pounded. Rules said never let the wild cross the threshold, but when he saw the pup shiver once, then fall still, the decision carved itself into his soul. He opened the door, and in that moment, 2 lives, and perhaps his own, changed forever. What happened next will break your heart and mend it again, making you believe in second chances. But first, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. The town of Silverpine, Montana, was a place where winters tested not just the body, but the spirit. Nestled deep in the northern Rockies, its cabins and narrow streets were often buried under snowdrifts taller than a man. On that December night, the wind howled like a living beast, rattling shutters and tearing through the pine forests as if it meant to rip the mountain itself apart. The thermometer outside Deputy Ryan Callahan's cabin had bottomed out at -58 degrees Fahrenheit, though the cold felt sharper still, a blade pressing against every surface it touched. Ryan had just returned from his night shift at the sheriff's substation. He was 36 years old, a man whose life had been split between the uniform of a U.S. Army sergeant and, later, the navy blue winter jacket of a county deputy. His tall frame carried the quiet endurance of someone who had marched through deserts, only to come home to the frozen silence of Montana mountains. His dark hair, streaked faintly with silver at the temples, was cropped short, and his storm-gray eyes held the tired focus of a man who trusted vigilance more than sleep. He hung his jacket on the rack, boots clumping snow onto the wooden floor. The cabin was simple, a single wood stove in the corner, a shelf of canned elk stew and beans, and an old wool blanket left behind by his late wife. Ryan had lived alone for 3 years, ever since a car accident took her life on an icy highway not far from town. People in Silverpine respected his solitude, though some whispered that he carried more ghosts than a man his age should. The wind hammered against the cabin walls, and Ryan poured himself a cup of coffee, its steam the only sign of warmth in the room. He had barely taken a sip when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to storm or timber. A faint, deliberate scratching at the door. He froze. His instincts sharpened instantly. Years of military service had taught him to listen to small irregularities, the silence before an ambush, the out-of-place rustle in a field. Here, the storm screamed, but beneath it pulsed something smaller, more desperate. He set down the mug and moved toward the door, every muscle taut. The scratching came again, not the random claw of a branch, nor the squeal of ice. It was rhythmic, insistent. Then a muffled whimper, a sound that pierced straight through the armor he wore around his heart. Ryan unlatched the door. The cold hit him first, a violent rush that stung his face and stiffened his beard. Snow swirled into the cabin, blinding for a heartbeat. Then the shape on the porch resolved into something living. It was a German shepherd mother, her fur stiff with frost, patches of ice clinging to her guard hairs like shards of glass. Her ribs showed beneath the thick coat, telling of hunger and exhaustion. She was young still, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, but her amber eyes glowed with a weary determination. In her jaws she carried a single pup, holding it gently by the scruff of its neck as shepherds do when there is no safer way. The puppy hung limp, its tiny body trembling in shallow spasms, its muzzle dusted white with frost. Ryan's chest tightened. The mother placed the pup down on the porch boards, then looked up at him. It was not the gaze of a wild creature, nor of an animal begging. It was something more deliberate in appeal, steady and raw, as if she had measured him from a distance and decided he was the last chance left. For a long moment, man and dog stood in the storm's breath, staring across the threshold. Ryan's mind replayed the words of Deputy Mark Ellison, his colleague at the substation earlier that evening. Mark, a broad-chested man in his 40s with sandy hair and a booming laugh, had said it as a joke while shrugging into his patrol coat. "Don't waste your kindness on strays, Callahan. Out here, if you open your door once, you'll never close it again." But, standing there, with the snow needling his skin and the pup barely moving on the porch, Ryan knew rules had never saved a soul in a storm this merciless. He knelt, lowering his tall frame so as not to tower over the mother. His gloved hand reached out, palm open. "Easy," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. It was the same tone he'd once used to calm young soldiers trembling after their first firefight. The mother didn't flinch. She didn't back away. She simply nudged the pup forward with her muzzle, as if offering proof of her intent. The pup gave a tiny, fragile whimper, then stilled again. Something shifted in Ryan. The solitude he had worn like armor cracked. Without another thought, he scooped the small bundle into his arms. The body was far too light, the fur wet and brittle against his coat. He could feel the faint beat of life fluttering like a moth's wing against his chest. He looked up. The mother's amber eyes never left him. She didn't cross the threshold. Not yet, but she didn't turn away either. Snow whipped around her, tugging at her ears and tail, but she stood steady, waiting for his decision. Ryan turned, pushing the door shut against the storm. Inside, the stove ticked as it swallowed another log, the orange glow spilling warmth into the room. He knelt on the braided rug, laying the pup carefully on the old wool blanket, then rubbed briskly along its sides, coaxing blood to move. The pup gave a faint twitch, then a small whimper, its ribcage lifting more steadily with each breath. Relief surged through him like fire thawing frozen veins. Behind him, the scratching came again. Not desperate this time, but patient. The mother dog pressed her paw lightly against the door, then waited. Ryan hesitated. The voice of his colleague echoed once more. "Don't bring strays inside." But rules seemed hollow against the sight of that pup. He opened the door wider. The storm roared in, carrying shards of snow that scattered across the floorboards. The mother stepped forward. Slowly, carefully, she crossed the threshold. Her posture remained protective, head low, eyes never leaving Ryan. She padded to where her pup lay and curled her body around it, her ribs forming a living wall of warmth. She licked its muzzle, then tucked it close against her chest. Ryan sat back on his heels, watching the scene with a stillness he hadn't known in years. The cabin, once only a bunker of solitude, now breathed with new life. He whispered, almost to himself, "You made the right call coming here." The storm continued to rage outside, battering the cabin with icy fists, but inside a fragile circle of warmth had taken root. Man, dog, and pup each caught in the same storm, each carrying scars of their own, had found a beginning. Ryan sat cross-legged on the braided rug, his large frame hunched forward, both palms rubbing briskly along the tiny shepherd pup's ribs. The puppy's chest moved in shallow but steady rhythm now, each breath like a small victory against the storm clawing at the windows. He tucked the wool blanket tighter around its trembling body, watching its eyes flutter before closing again. Relief loosened the knot in his chest, though he knew the pup was far from safe. The mother dog stood a few steps away, close enough to see everything but far enough to keep a barrier between them. Her amber eyes were unblinking, her muscles taut beneath a coat matted with ice and snow. She neither growled nor relaxed, simply waited, her ears twitching each time Ryan shifted his weight. The trust was fragile, held together by nothing more than the pup's fragile life. Ryan rose slowly, careful not to startle her. His boots creaked on the wood floor as he moved to the small kitchen space. He opened a cupboard and pulled out a mason jar filled with smoked venison strips, wrapped in paper by one of the ranchers outside town. From the shelf above, he fetched a steel bowl and filled it with warm water from the kettle steaming on the stove. He set both down on the floor, sliding them a few feet toward the thrum of the fire. At first, the mother didn't move. Her gaze flicked from the food to her pup and back again, weighing the risk. Her ribs expanded with a slow breath. Then, as if her decision was carved by necessity, she stepped forward, head low, eyes never leaving Ryan. She sniffed the bowl first, then touched her nose to the venison. Her jaw worked quietly as she chewed, each bite precise, efficient, like a creature who had learned not to waste energy. Ryan leaned against the chair, watching in silence. Something about the scene tugged at memories he had tried to bury. He thought back to Afghanistan dust in his teeth, sweat stinging his eyes, the constant hum of danger in the air. He remembered a German shepherd named Rex, a military working dog that had saved his unit by alerting them to a buried IED. He remembered the handler's face, a young corporal who later didn't make it out of a firefight. Dogs carried burdens in silence, and so did the men who relied on them. As the mother lowered her head to take another piece, the firelight caught on a patch of bare fur just beneath her neck. Ryan narrowed his eyes, crouching slightly for a better look. There, faint but unmistakable, was a small tattoo letters and numbers etched in blue-black ink. It was the mark every K9 unit carried, a permanent identifier of their service. His breath caught. This wasn't just a stray who stumbled to his door. She was trained, disciplined, once part of a team. She belonged to someone, or had belonged. What had happened? How had she ended up in the wilderness carrying a single pup through a storm that could freeze a man solid in minutes? Ryan reached a hand toward her, stopping just short of her fur. She lifted her head instantly, eyes narrowing, a low rumble vibrating in her chest. He pulled back, palms open. "Easy," he murmured. "I just wanted to see." The mother licked her muzzle, then lowered herself beside the pup, curling her body protectively. She nosed the blanket, tucking the puppy closer to her chest. Her ears flicked at the sound of the wind rattling the shutters, then returned to him, steady, watchful. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the old tension gather in his shoulders. He had made a rule for himself after his wife's accident. No attachments, no openings. People in Silverpine respected him for his steady hand on patrol, but they whispered about the loneliness he carried. Now, here he was, with a pup wrapped in his wife's blanket and a mother bearing the mark of service. He had broken his rule, and it seemed the world was conspiring to make sure he couldn't go back. The fire snapped, sending a spray of sparks against the iron stove. Ryan poured himself another cup of coffee and sat in the chair nearest the door. He kept his eyes on the pair near the hearth. The pup stirred once, giving a weak whimper, and the mother immediately licked its muzzle until it settled. Her tail curled tightly around them both. Ryan's phone buzzed faintly from his coat pocket where he'd left it on the hook. He pulled it free and saw a text from Deputy Mark Ellison, his colleague at the substation. Mark, a man in his 40s with a wide chest and sandy hair, had the habit of checking in on Ryan when he thought the younger deputy might be stewing alone. The message read, "Blizzard's rough tonight. Hope you're not wasting time on strays like you usually do. Stay warm, brother." Ryan stared at the words, then at the dogs by the fire. He didn't reply. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered softly into the quiet cabin, "You're not strays, are you? You're survivors." The mother dog blinked slowly, as though acknowledging him. For the first time since she entered, her body eased by a fraction, the tight coil of her muscles loosening into something closer to rest. The storm outside pressed against the walls with relentless force, but within the cabin, another kind of weather was forming. Not warmth exactly, not trust yet, but the fragile beginning of both. Ryan didn't know what would come next. He only knew that he had made a choice. He had opened the door. He had broken his rule. And somehow, as he watched the small rise and fall of the pup's breathing and the steady vigil of its mother, he felt less like a man who had lost everything and more like one who had been given something back. Morning broke reluctantly over Silverpine, the storm slackening but leaving behind a world buried beneath white. Snowbanks leaned against cabin walls, and the pines sagged heavy with frost. The air outside was still merciless, the thermometer pinned far below zero, but the wind had quieted to a brittle silence. Inside Ryan's cabin, the stove glowed with orange embers, the only barrier between life and the cold that clawed at the windows. Ryan shifted in his chair, every joint stiff from a night of half-sleep. He had dozed upright, one eye always open, never able to fully surrender rest after years of training himself to wake at the smallest sound. The German Shepherd mother lay curled on the braided rug, her body forming a fortress of warmth around her pup. The little one stirred weakly, pressing its nose deeper into the wool blanket Ryan had tucked around it. Watching them, Ryan felt the knot in his chest loosen just slightly. He had risen to pour himself coffee when movement outside caught his eye. Through the frost-blurred window he made out a tall, wiry figure trudging the ridge path toward his cabin. The gait was familiar measured, sturdy, unhurried. He knew who it was before she even came into focus. Margaret Evans was his nearest neighbor, a woman in her early 60s who had lived on the land nearly her entire life. Her husband, Henry, had died in a logging accident over a decade ago, and since then Margaret had run her small ranch alone. She was lean, weather-hardened, with long limbs built for work, her shoulders still squared from years of carrying hay bales and chopping wood. Her lined face carried both strength and sorrow, but her gray eyes often shone with kindness. This morning she wore a patched wool coat, boots caked with snow, and a knitted cap pulled low, a scarf wrapped high around her cheeks. In her gloved hands she carried a cloth-covered basket and a small glass bottle that caught the light. Ryan opened the door before she had the chance to knock. "Morning, Margaret," he said, voice rough with fatigue. "Morning, Ryan," she answered, her breath curling in the cold. She lifted the basket. "Storm's been keeping everyone penned in. Thought I'd bring by some bread, and—" She held up the bottle. "A little goat's milk. Always keep some when I've got weak lambs. Figured you might use it." She stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots. As she pulled off her scarf, her eyes landed on the scene by the fire. The shepherd mother lifted her head, ears pricked, eyes sharp. The pup shifted beneath the blanket. Margaret's hand paused mid-motion, her expression softening in surprise. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "Didn't expect a company like that." Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. "Showed up on my porch last night." The pup was barely breathing. Margaret set the basket on the table and crouched near the rug, moving slow and deliberate, the way a seasoned farmer would around skittish animals. "Poor thing," she murmured, studying the pup. She kept her movements small, respectful of the mother's watchful stare. "Looks like it's hanging by a thread." She unwrapped the bottle from its cloth and handed it to Ryan. "Warm it up a touch by the stove. Use a dropper or even a spoon if that's all you've got. A bit at a time." Goat's milk works wonders when nothing else will do. Ryan followed her instructions, setting the bottle near the stove until it was warm to the touch, then pouring a little into a cup. He found an old medicine dropper in a drawer, rinsed it quickly, and knelt beside the pup. The mother tensed, ears forward, but didn't interfere. Ryan squeezed a few drops into the puppy's mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then its tiny tongue flicked, tasting the liquid. It swallowed, weak but determined, and after a second attempt it lapped more steadily. Ryan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The pup gave a faint whimper, then nestled tighter against its mother's chest, its breathing just a little stronger. Margaret smiled faintly, lines at the corners of her eyes softening. "See? Doesn't take much, just a bit of care and something warm in the belly. I've pulled more than a few lambs back that way." She reached out, brushing her fingers against the blanket, but not touching the pup itself. "She's a fine dog," she said of the mother, nodding in quiet admiration. "Carries herself like she's known people before. You don't get that steady look in their eyes from the wild alone." Ryan thought of the faint K9 tattoo he had spotted beneath her neck the night before. He didn't mention it, not yet. But Margaret's words echoed what he already suspected. This was no ordinary stray. The mother lowered her head and licked her pup, but her body seemed less rigid now, as if Margaret's presence eased the tension. Ryan watched her for a long moment, then looked back at Margaret, who was still crouched by the fire. "My Henry loved shepherds," Margaret went on and on, her voice gentler now. Always said they had more sense than half the men in town. We kept 2 on the ranch. Loyal, protective. You could trust them with your life. Seeing her here, carrying her little one through a storm like last night, it's proof enough she belonged to someone once." Ryan's throat tightened, though he covered it with a swallow of coffee. The memory of Rex, the military dog overseas, returned unbidden. He had seen the same steadiness in those amber eyes. Margaret stood, brushing off her knees. "You're a good man for letting them in, Ryan." Most folks would have shut the door. Ryan gave a low laugh, dry. Most folks probably would have been smarter. Margaret placed a firm hand on his arm, her grip stronger than her thin frame suggested. "Sometimes it isn't about what's smart. Sometimes it's about what's right. The Lord has a way of putting things in our path for a reason. You may not have planned on them, but maybe you were meant to." Ryan didn't reply, but her words sank deep, unsettling and comforting all at once. They shared coffee at the table for a few quiet minutes, the fire snapping, the pup breathing steadier. Then Margaret pulled her scarf back around her face and lifted the empty basket. "Keep giving that little one milk every couple of hours. She'll pull through with care. And don't forget to feed the mother proper. She's running herself ragged keeping that pup alive." She paused at the door, her eyes softening as she looked once more at the dogs. "You take care of them, Ryan, and maybe let them take care of you too." Then she stepped out into the snow, her tracks already disappearing as the wind swept across the ridge. Ryan closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, her words echoing in his mind. He turned back to the fire, where the shepherd mother lay curled around her pup, both breathing more easily now. The bottle of goat's milk glinted on the table, a quiet reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could mean the difference between life and death. The day after Margaret's visit dawned pale and brittle, the kind of winter morning where the sun seemed to hesitate at the horizon, unable to push its warmth through the veil of frost. Silverpine lay hushed under its heavy quilt of snow, but Ryan could not shake the weight in his chest. The German shepherd mother rested with her pup near the fire, both steadier now thanks to milk and warmth. But Ryan's instincts told him peace was fragile here, more fragile than it looked. By mid-afternoon, he shrugged into his thick patrol jacket, strapped on his belt with the badge glinting against the dark fabric, and pulled his gloves tight. The department had insisted he take light duties during the storm cycle, but being a police officer in Silverpine meant the lines between duty and survival blurred often. He stepped outside into the sting of minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit wind chill, the crunch of his boots echoing off the trees. The forest was familiar to him, yet something about the silence set his nerves on edge. Deer trails crossed the drifts, fox tracks skittered across open clearings, but as he moved deeper into the woods, he came across something that didn't fit. A fresh set of footprints stamped into the snow, larger than his own, with a heavier tread, as though the person carried weight on their back. The stride was purposeful, not wandering. Ryan crouched, brushing snow aside with his gloved hand. The prints led toward the ridge, but what disturbed him more was what he found nearby. A metal snare half buried under loose powder, its teeth glinting faintly. He frowned, jaw tightening. In Montana's backcountry, snares and traps were technically legal under certain permits, but they were rarely set so close to residential areas, and never on his patrol route. He stood, scanning the tree line. The forest gave nothing back except the groan of branches shedding ice, yet the feeling stayed with him, like eyes just beyond sight. He marked the location in his notebook, then retraced his steps to the cabin. The storm was forecast to thicken again overnight, and the last thing he wanted was to stumble on someone reckless enough to lay traps during a blizzard. That evening, Ryan fed another log into the stove, the fire crackling as sparks danced up the flue. He poured himself coffee, staring into the flames, but his mind replayed the prints, the snare, the way the stride had looked deliberate. The German shepherd mother stirred, ears twitching, her head lifting from the rug, her amber eyes fixed on the window, body stiffening. A low growl rippled from her chest. Ryan set down his mug, every sense alert. He reached for the flashlight on the counter and flicked it off, letting the cabin fall into shadows. Moving quietly to the window, he peeled back the curtain just an inch. For a heartbeat, all he saw was snow swirling under the moonlight. Then movement, slow, deliberate between the pines. A silhouette, tall and narrow, paused just outside the clearing. The figure lingered too long, watching, before slipping back into the dark. The growl in the shepherd mother deepened. Ryan laid a calming hand on her shoulder, though his own pulse hammered. He knew hunters had grown up around them. Hunters didn't linger near windows in the dead of night. The radio crackled when he reported into the station. The dispatcher, a young officer named Eli Turner, picked up. Eli was 28, stocky from years of weight training, with a square jaw and a habit of taking everything at face value. He had joined the Silver Pine Force after leaving a construction job in Billings, and his uniform still looked too crisp, his boots too new. "You're saying you saw someone near your cabin?" Eli asked, his tone casual, almost amused. "Probably just a hunter running late. Guys set snares out there all the time this season." Ryan pinched the bridge of his nose. "Not this close, Eli. Not in this weather, and he wasn't carrying a rifle." He was watching. On the other end of the line, Eli gave a soft chuckle. "Well, you've got company now, don't you?" Maybe the dog's just nervous. Could be spooked by shadows. Ryan let silence fill the channel before responding. "Shadows don't leave footprints." He signed off before Eli could reply, setting the radio back on the counter. The shepherd mother still stood by the window, her body taut, her pup squeaking faintly at her side. Ryan crouched beside her, meeting her wary gaze. "You trust your instincts," he whispered. "So do I." He checked the deadbolt twice and pulled the rifle from its place by the door, laying it across the table. The cabin walls groaned under the wind, but it was the memory of that silhouette that pressed against him hardest. Whoever had been out there wasn't lost. They were looking, and Ryan knew, with the kind of certainty born of both soldiering and policing, that tonight was only the beginning. The storm outside had eased into a steady fall, fine flakes drifting down from a sky the color of iron. The cabin sat buried beneath its blanket of snow, and inside the fire worked tirelessly to keep the cold at bay. Ryan stood by the stove, stirring the embers, when a sound behind him made his chest tighten, a weak, rasping whimper. He turned quickly. The pup lay on the folded blanket near the hearth, its tiny body trembling, its breaths shallow and uneven. Only hours earlier it had nestled close to its mother with fragile but steady strength. Now its sides barely rose and fell. Ryan's instincts screamed louder than any storm. He crouched down, pressing 2 fingers gently against its chest, feeling for the faint rhythm of life. It was there, but fragile, like a candle fighting against a draft. The mother dog hovered, pacing anxiously in a tight circle, her amber eyes darting between her pup and Ryan. Her body was tense, ears pitched forward, but the panic in her posture was unmistakable. Ryan swallowed hard, his training as an officer and as a soldier flooding back stabilize, improvise, act quickly. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured, scooping the pup gently into his hands. Its body was chilling fast. He held it close to his chest, feeling its faint warmth seep into his jacket. He carried it nearer the fire, then called out into the storm of memory that still lived inside him. "Margaret!" Minutes later, the cabin door swung open, letting in a gust of cold and the woman herself. Margaret Evans, bundled in her patched wool coat and boots, her scarf trailing snowflakes, stepped inside with quick urgency. She was 62, strong from years on her ranch, her face lined but full of determination. She saw the pup in Ryan's arms and wasted no time. "What happened?" she asked, stripping her gloves as she crossed the floor. "It just weakened." Breathing shallow. "Won't keep warm," Ryan said, his voice low, urgent. Margaret took the pup from him with a gentleness that belied her roughened hands. "We don't have minutes to waste," she said, kneeling before the fire. She rubbed the pup briskly along its flanks, her palms working in steady rhythm. "We need heat and a bit of strength in its belly." Ryan hurried to the table where the bottle of goat's milk still sat from her earlier visit. He warmed it quickly by setting it near the stove, then fetched an old medicine dropper. Kneeling beside her, he drew in a few drops of the warm liquid and held the tip carefully against the pup's mouth. At first, nothing. The tiny jaw stayed slack. Ryan's throat tightened. But then, with a faint flicker, the pup's tongue moved. A weak swallow followed. Ryan exchanged a glance with Margaret, whose lined face softened into fierce encouragement. "That's it. Just a little more," she urged. They worked together in silence, the fire crackling, the storm pressing against the cabin walls. Margaret rubbed warmth into the pup's limbs while Ryan gave another drop, then another. Slowly, the weak chest began to rise with a steadier rhythm. The pup gave a soft whimper, louder than before, and turned its head, pressing against the fold of Ryan's scarf as if to seek shelter. Ryan exhaled a shaky breath, relief flooding his chest. Margaret sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the edge of her sleeve. "It's not out of danger yet, but it's stronger. Keep him warm, keep him close, and he might just surprise us." The mother dog had not moved far during the ordeal. She stood only a pace away, her eyes locked on every motion, her body quivering with tension. As Ryan gently laid the pup back onto the blanket by the fire, the mother stepped forward, her ears twitching, her nose brushing over the pup to reassure herself. Then she looked at Ryan. For days she had been cautious, guarding every step, her body a wall between man and pup. But now something shifted. She lowered her head slowly, deliberately, and licked Ryan's hand where it still rested on the blanket. The touch was fleeting, but unmistakable. A gesture of trust, born not from desperation but from recognition. Ryan froze, staring at the damp mark left by her tongue. His chest tightened in an unexpected way, not with fear or strain, but with something lighter. A laugh, small and rusty, slipped from him before he could stop it. It startled him, the first time he had laughed in months, since the accident had taken his wife. The sound was awkward, almost foreign, but real. Margaret, still kneeling beside him, gave him a sidelong look, her gray eyes soft. "Good to hear that sound again," she said simply. Ryan rubbed a hand over his face, embarrassed and grateful all at once. He watched as the mother curled herself around the pup, pressing her body to his to share her warmth. The little one's breaths evened out, steady and strong. The cabin was quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a hearth alive with breath, with presence, with fragile but undeniable trust. Ryan leaned back against the wall, feeling his exhaustion seep away, replaced by something steadier. He had thought he was the one protecting them, shielding them from the storm, from traps, from strangers in the woods. But now he realized they were protecting him, too, from loneliness, from the heavy shadow of grief, from the cold that had crept into his soul long before winter. And, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The storm thickened as evening pressed in, the wind clawing at the cabin walls with a shrill, insistent cry. Snow swirled past the windows, sometimes blotting them out entirely, sometimes thinning enough to reveal the darkened line of trees. Ryan had settled into the quiet routine of tending the stove, checking the pup's breathing, and watching the German Shepherd mother stretch out protectively on the rug. The trust she had offered earlier lingered like a fragile warmth in the room, but Ryan's instincts had not relaxed. His mind kept circling back to the traps, the footprints, and the shadowy figure he'd glimpsed days ago. It was nearly midnight when the knock came. 3 deliberate raps against the door, loud enough to slice through the storm's howl. Ryan stiffened, every muscle coiling tight. The shepherd mother shot up instantly, hackles raised, her body positioned over her pup. A growl rumbled deep in her chest, low and warning. Ryan crossed the room in silence, his rifle leaning within easy reach, his free hand brushing the latch. When he pulled the door open, a man stood in the threshold, hunched against the storm. He was tall but gaunt, his frame wrapped in a patched parka whose seams leaked snow. His face was narrow, sunken at the cheeks, with skin weathered by years of hard living. A jagged scar cut across his chin, puckered and white against the windburn. His hair was dark, straggling from beneath a frayed wool cap, and his eyes gray, cold, and sharp as broken glass flicked immediately past Ryan into the cabin. "Evening," the man said, his voice rasped raw by smoke and weather. "Name's Raymond." Raymond Cole. Storm caught me out. Thought I might come in, warm myself a spell. Ryan studied him with a soldier's patience, noting details the way he always did. Boots caked with ice but worn thin at the soles, gloves mismatched, a heavy canvas pack slung across his back, bulging at odd angles. Cole looked like a man who'd spent too many nights outdoors and too many days running from something he wouldn't name. Ryan's instincts screamed caution, but hospitality in Montana winters was nearly law. He opened the door just enough to let Cole step inside, snow tumbling in with him. The man stamped his boots, tugging off his gloves, and let his eyes roam across the cabin. They landed on the shepherd mother and her pup. His lips twitched into something not quite a smile. "Didn't expect company," he murmured. The mother growled louder, placing herself squarely between Cole and the pup. Her amber eyes were locked on him, unwavering. Cole tilted his head, regarding her too long, as if weighing more than just an animal. "Fine-looking dog," he said, voice low, speculative. "Rare to see one like her wandering free out here." Ryan moved deliberately, stepping between Cole's line of sight and the animals. "Coffee's hot," he said evenly, gesturing toward the pot on the stove. "You can have a cup before you head on." Cole's gaze lingered another moment before he shrugged and shuffled toward the table, lowering himself onto the chair with a loose, wiry grace. He wrapped long fingers around the steaming mug Ryan handed him, but his eyes kept straying back to the shepherd mother. She hadn't moved, her growl softening to a steady rumble, her body taut like a drawn bow. They spoke little. Cole muttered about the storm, about hunting trails iced over, about supplies running low. His words seemed practiced, offered like a shield. Ryan answered politely, but without warmth. His attention divided between Cole's restless eyes and the firelight flickering across the rifle resting against the wall. The storm raged until dawn, and by then Cole rose, pulling his gloves back on. "Obliged," he said, though his tone carried no gratitude. His gaze swept once more across the pup, then he pulled his hood up and stepped back into the snow, vanishing into the white as quickly as he had appeared. When the door shut, the shepherd mother relaxed slightly but remained close to her pup, her growl echoing in Ryan's ears long after. He stood by the window, watching the storm swallow Cole's figure, unease gnawing at him. It was Margaret who arrived later that morning, her coat dusted with snow, her scarf pulled low across her face. She set down a basket of supplies before even removing her gloves, her gray eyes sharp as she caught the tension in Ryan's stance. "You had a visitor," she said, more statement than question. Ryan nodded, recounting the knock, the gaunt figure, the way Cole's gaze had clung to the dog's. Margaret's face darkened. "There's been talk in town," she said quietly. "Rumors about men moving through the backwoods, looking for working dogs. Not strays, not farm mutts, trained stock. There's a market for them, cruel as it is, smuggling them out, selling them to the highest bidder." Ryan's gut clenched. He glanced at the mother, her head lifted, ears forward as if she understood. Margaret touched his arm. "You be careful, Ryan. If that man comes back, it won't be for coffee." The fire crackled between them, but the warmth suddenly felt fragile. Ryan looked from Margaret to the shepherd mother, to the small pup nestled against her, and knew with iron certainty danger was no longer rumor. It was at his door. The storm had calmed by morning, though the world outside was still locked in white silence. Ryan sat at his worn oak desk, the old lamp casting a pale circle of light over the stack of reports he had pulled from the precinct archives the night before. The memory of Raymond Cole's visit gnawed at him, sharper than the wind itself. Margaret's warning echoed, men moving through the backwoods, not for strays, but for trained dogs. Ryan had always trusted instinct over rumor, and his instinct screamed that the shepherd mother in his cabin wasn't just another abandoned animal. He opened the folders, flipping through the grainy photographs and faded typed lines. The reports dated back nearly 6 months. A series of German shepherds had gone missing from a training facility outside Denver, each case filed quietly, almost buried beneath bureaucratic language. Most were marked presumed lost during transfer or escaped, not recovered. But Ryan had served long enough to know what careful wording meant. Someone didn't want questions asked. His eyes lingered on one file in particular. The description matched the shepherd mother almost exactly. Female, sable and black coat, scar on the left ear from an old training incident. He glanced up at her now, lying curled around her pup by the hearth, her ear twitching in her sleep. The scar was there. Faint but undeniable. Ryan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. His gaze dropped to her paws. Calluses marred the pads, worn in a way only miles of patrols and drills could make. No farm dog carried themselves like that. He remembered the way she had stiffened at Cole's presence, not just protective, but tactical, placing herself in line with the door, weight forward, eyes locked, as though trained to assess threats. A thought crept in, unsettling yet grounding. She was K9 once. A partner, abandoned or stolen, then discarded into this wilderness. Ryan closed the file slowly, his throat tight. Memories stirred of his own years in uniform overseas, of working alongside handlers and their dogs. He had seen them drag wounded soldiers from ambushes, sniff out hidden dangers, comfort men who thought themselves too hardened for comfort. He remembered one handler, Sergeant Lewis, whose German shepherd had saved an entire convoy from an IED. Ryan had envied that bond back then, the wordless trust, the kind of loyalty no human could replicate. He had dreamed as a boy of having a dog like that at his side, a partner in the truest sense. But life had taken different turns. Deployments, patrols, paperwork, and later, grief. Now, without seeking it, that dream seemed to have walked through his door during the storm. The pup stirred, letting out a soft squeak, and the mother lifted her head, eyes glowing amber in the firelight. She met Ryan's gaze, steady and unblinking. For the first time, he felt she wasn't just watching him, she was measuring him, the way soldiers weighed one another in silence. The radio crackled suddenly, pulling him from his thoughts. A familiar voice came through. Deputy Eli Turner, the young officer whose easy dismissal still grated at Ryan. "Morning update," Eli drawled. "Few reports of poachers near the river, nothing concrete. You keeping warm up there?" Ryan pressed the receiver, his voice steady but edged. "I've been going through the missing shepherd reports out of Denver." "Matches the dog here, Eli." "This isn't some stray." There was a pause, then Eli's half-hearted chuckle. "Ryan, you're chasing ghosts. Dogs get lost all the time. Besides, what's it matter if she came from Denver or Duluth? You planning to file adoption papers?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "It matters because men are looking for her. Men like Raymond Cole, and if she's a stolen K9, someone will pay good money to take her back, or worse." Silence stretched on the line before Eli muttered something about conspiracy theories and signed off. Ryan set the receiver down hard, frustration simmering beneath his calm. The shepherd mother shifted, rising slowly to her feet. She padded toward him, her movements smooth, controlled. When she reached his chair, she sat, posture straight, eyes locked on his face. Ryan exhaled, a strange sense of recognition stirring deep inside him. "You were someone's partner once," he murmured. "Now maybe you're mine." The words sounded foolish in the empty cabin, but they carried weight. He thought again of his boyhood dream, of standing shoulder to shoulder with a dog trained for more than just loyalty, but for service, for courage. And here she was, scarred, wary, but alive, with a pup who had already brought her back from the brink of despair. Ryan reached out, letting his hand rest lightly on her head. For a moment, she tensed. Then she leaned into the touch, not fully, but enough. The pup mewled from the rug and she returned to him, but the moment lingered. Ryan turned back to the fire, his decision forming like steel. Whatever past she carried, whatever men like Cole sought, she was no longer just a survivor. She was part of something he hadn't realized he still craved. A partnership, a family, a reason to guard his home not just with duty, but with heart. The cabin was heavy with silence, the kind that arrives just before something breaks. Outside, the wind had died down, but the snow still drifted in lazy spirals under a pale moon. Ryan sat in his chair, rifle propped against the table, the radio turned low beside him. He hadn't slept. Every creak of the walls, every hiss of frost across the windows kept him awake. The shepherd mother lay curled on the rug, her pup pressed tightly against her, but even in rest her ears twitched at the slightest sound. It was just past midnight when the moment came. A faint scrape against the porch, so deliberate it sliced through the stillness. Then another. Ryan's breath misted in the cold air as he reached for the rifle, his body coiled. The shepherd mother snapped awake, a guttural bark tearing from her throat. She seized her pup by the scruff and retreated toward the darkest corner of the room, teeth bared, barking with fury. Ryan's stomach dropped. Only one man would be bold enough to come back like this. The knock never came. Instead, the door latch jiggled, rattled, and then a shoulder slammed hard against the wood. Ryan surged forward, throwing his weight against the door just as it buckled. "Open it up, Callahan!" A voice rasped from the other side, cold, edged with anger. Raymond Cole. Ryan shouted back, "You picked the wrong cabin, Cole!" But Cole was already forcing harder, his frame thudding against the door. The mother barked again, a warning that cracked like gunfire. Ryan caught her eye, a flash of shared understanding sparking between man and dog. He yanked the door open suddenly, letting Cole stumble forward into the room. The man looked worse in the lamplight gaunt face twisted with desperation, eyes sharp and glinting. Snow clung to his patched parka, and his gloves were torn, revealing long fingers hardened with calluses. In his hand he clutched a length of rope, coiled and ready. His gaze locked instantly on the shepherd mother and her pup. "She's mine," Cole hissed. "They took her from the unit. I've been tracking her for weeks. She's worth more than you'll ever make in this backwater town." Ryan stepped between him and the animals, rifle raised but not yet fired. "She's not yours, and she's not merchandise. You want to make this ugly? Fine, but you won't leave here with her." Cole's eyes flicked, feral, as if calculating whether he could get around Ryan. Then he lunged. The rifle clattered as Ryan deflected him, the two men grappling in the cramped cabin. The table tipped, mugs shattering on the floor. Cole fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose, fists driving like hammers. Ryan, trained and hardened by years of combat and patrol, held his ground, though each blow rattled his bones. The shepherd mother snarled, circling, her pup hidden behind the woodpile. When Cole shoved Ryan against the wall, pinning him with one hand and reaching for the dog with the rope, she launched herself. Her jaws clamped around his wrist, teeth sinking through flesh and glove. Cole screamed, thrashing, but she held firm, dragging him down. Ryan seized the opening. With a grunt, he wrenched Cole's arm behind his back and forced him face first into the floor. The man writhed, but the mother's grip and Ryan's weight broke his fight. Ryan kicked the rope aside and twisted the man's wrist until the strength drained out of him. "Enough!" Ryan barked, breath ragged. "It's over!" Cole's breathing was harsh, ragged, his face pressed against the boards. Blood dripped from his bitten wrist, staining the snow that had blown in across the threshold. The radio crackled, almost drowned in the chaos, and Margaret's voice came through, tight with alarm. She had heard the dogs barking from her farmhouse down the ridge, and she had already called the sheriff's office. Within minutes, headlights slashed through the trees, casting long shadows across the snow. 2 officers burst inside, weapons drawn. One was Sheriff Daniels, a thick-set man in his 50s with a weathered face and steady presence, his parka dusted white from the storm. The other, young Officer Hernandez, barely 25, with dark hair and sharp eyes, his uniform still too crisp for the rugged terrain. They froze at the sight. Ryan kneeling over Cole, rifle nearby, the shepherd mother still bristling with fury. Ryan rose slowly, keeping Cole pinned. "Caught him trying to take her." He admitted it. Sheriff Daniels bent down, pulling Cole upright with a grunt. The man spat blood into the snow, but said nothing, his eyes flashing with venom. Daniels shook his head grimly. "We've had word about this one. Smuggling trained shepherds, selling them overseas. He's a piece of a bigger chain." Margaret appeared then, framed in the doorway, her scarf still wrapped tight against the cold. She looked at Ryan, then at the mother and pup, her face softening with relief. "I was right," she said quietly. "This wasn't just rumor." Ryan exhaled, the adrenaline slowly draining. He knelt, checking on the pup, who whimpered but seemed safe in the corner. The mother relaxed, padding forward to press her muzzle against Ryan's arm, a silent acknowledgement. The officers led Cole out into the storm, his protests muffled by the wind. Margaret lingered behind, laying a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "You've done more than just protect them, Ryan. You've uncovered something bigger, but, more than that, you've given her a reason to trust again." Ryan didn't answer at first. He simply looked down at the mother, her amber eyes steady on his, the pup nudging weakly at her side. In their gaze, he felt not just gratitude, but an unspoken bond, an understanding that neither of them had to stand alone anymore. The storm finally broke with the dawn, leaving Silverpine blanketed in a white so pure it seemed untouched by human hands. Sunlight spilled through the cabin window, glittering off icicles that hung like chandeliers. For the first time in days, Ryan let himself breathe freely. The danger was behind them, at least for now, and what remained was the steady rhythm of life returning. The pup, once frail and clinging to the edge of breath, now tumbled across the rug in playful bursts of energy. Its paws slipped on the wooden floor, its tiny bark echoing against the walls. Ryan chuckled as he bent to scoop it up, the warmth of its small body radiating through his calloused hands. The mother dog watched from her spot by the fire, her eyes softer now, no longer filled with suspicion but with something closer to trust. Ryan had made a decision, one that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. That morning, he drove into town, the pup nestled in a basket on the seat beside him and the mother close at his heel. At the Silverpine Sheriff's Office, he filled out the necessary paperwork, hands steady as he signed the adoption documents. Sheriff Daniels, who had been there the night Cole was taken away, stamped the final sheet with an approving nod. "You're doing the right thing," Daniels said. The sheriff was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, his lined face bearing the weight of years in law enforcement. He wore his tan uniform under a thick winter coat, and his voice carried the calm of a man who had weathered storms both natural and human. "She's got history, Ryan. But she deserves a future, and from what I've seen, so do you." Ryan only nodded, his throat tight. He had thought the process would feel like formality, but instead it felt like an oath, a vow etched in ink and memory. When he returned to the cabin later that afternoon, Margaret was already waiting on the porch, a basket balanced in her arms. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her gray scarf tied neatly under her chin. She greeted him with her usual blend of practicality and warmth, stepping inside as though the cabin were as much hers as his. "I brought something," she said, setting the basket on the table. From it, she drew a worn leather collar, the brass buckle dulled but sturdy. The name, Faith, was etched into the metal tag, the letters softened by time. "It belonged to my husband's shepherd," Margaret explained, her voice carrying both pride and a trace of sorrow. "That dog guarded our farm for 10 years. Loyal, steadfast. When I saw her," she nodded toward the shepherd mother, "I knew this belonged with her." Ryan held the collar for a moment, running his thumb across the nameplate. He crouched down beside the mother, speaking softly. "Faith," he whispered, fastening the collar gently around her neck. The dog stood tall, the brass tag glinting in the firelight, as though she had stepped fully into her new role. The pup barked excitedly, circling them both before collapsing in a heap on the rug. Ryan laughed, the sound freer now, lighter than it had been in years. Margaret smiled, her eyes misty. Word of the storm and the strange rescue spread quickly through Silverpine. At evening, neighbors began arriving one by one, trudging through the snow with baskets and bundles. A retired miner named Harold, thick-bearded and broad in his flannel coat, brought venison jerky wrapped in butcher paper. Young couples from the edge of town brought blankets stitched with care. Children clutched small tins of biscuits, shy but eager to see the dogs. "This is what we do," Harold said simply as he handed Ryan the bundle. "When the storm takes, we give back, and this time it feels like a miracle gave us something in return." Ryan stood by the door, overwhelmed by the quiet generosity. Faith sat proudly at his side, the pup darting between legs and boots, delighting the children with its clumsy enthusiasm. For the first time since his wife's accident, the cabin didn't feel like a place of solitude. It felt like home, alive, warm, and filled with voices. Later that night, after the neighbors had gone and the gifts were neatly stacked in the corner, Ryan sat by the fire with Margaret. Faith lay stretched across the rug, the pup curled into her side. Margaret sipped tea, her hands steady despite her years. "You see, Ryan," she said gently, "sometimes God sends us what we need in the harshest storms. Not to test us, but to remind us we're not alone." Ryan nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Faith, the brass tag catching the firelight. The pup stirred and let out a soft sigh, the sound filling the cabin with peace. Ryan leaned back, the weight of grief still there but softened, reshaped by the warmth now surrounding him. For the first time he allowed himself to imagine tomorrow, not as something to endure, but as something to look forward to. The morning air in Silverpine was crystalline, so clear it seemed every sound traveled miles. The storm had passed days ago, leaving the Montana forest buried under heavy snow that sparkled beneath the pale winter sun. Ryan stood on the porch of his cabin, hands tucked into the pockets of his dark wool coat, breath clouding in front of him. Before him, the German shepherd Mother Faith bounded gently through the drifts, her pup tumbling after her in clumsy joy. Their play was simple, unguarded, the kind of joy Ryan had not witnessed in years. He leaned against the porch railing, a smile tugging at his lips, but his eyes softened with something deeper. "It's you two who saved me," he murmured under his breath, "not the other way around." The words came out unpracticed, as though pulled straight from his chest. Margaret arrived not long after, wrapped in her heavy wool coat and scarf, cheeks pink from the walk up the trail. In her hands she carried a thermos of hot cider and a small cloth bundle. She looked every bit the part of a woman shaped by Montana winters. Sturdy boots dusted with snow, gloved hands steady despite her age. The kindness in her gray eyes was the same as it had been the first day she had stepped into his cabin. She poured cider into 2 tin cups and handed one to Ryan. He accepted it with a grateful nod, the warmth seeping through his gloves. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Faith nose her pup gently into a mound of snow before the little one wriggled free and bounded clumsily back. Margaret finally spoke, her voice steady but carrying a weight of conviction. "Ryan, don't think for a second this was chance. God doesn't work in chance. He sent them here, not only to be saved, but to save you." Ryan let the words linger. He had never been quick to lean on Faith since the accident that had taken his wife, but standing there with the 2 animals who had transformed his silent cabin into a home, he felt something stir. It wasn't the sharp ache of loss anymore, it was gentler, like thawing ice. The door creaked open behind them and Sheriff Daniels stepped into the yard. He was off duty now, wearing a sheepskin jacket and jeans, his broad frame casting a long shadow in the snow. He carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man who had seen too many storms, both in weather and in people. "Just wanted to check in," Daniels said, his deep voice rolling like gravel. "Words spread across town about what happened. Folks are calling it a miracle." His gaze drifted toward Faith and her pup. "Truth be told, I think they're right." Ryan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Miracles don't usually knock at your door in the middle of the night." "Maybe not," Daniels replied, "but sometimes they scratch until you answer." The sheriff's eyes softened for a moment. Then he gave a small nod and headed back down the trail, leaving Ryan and Margaret with the silence of the snow once again. Faith returned to the porch then, her pup clamped gently in her jaws by the scruff of its neck. She placed it at Ryan's feet before sitting back on her haunches, amber eyes fixed on him with quiet devotion. The pup yipped, shaking loose clumps of snow from its fur, then stumbled toward the edge of the yard where the snow was unbroken. Ryan followed, his boots crunching over the hardened crust. Faith picked up the pup again, carrying it carefully by the nape. Together, the three of them moved across the white expanse, leaving behind a neat trail of footprints, 2 human, 4 steady paw prints, and the faint drag marks of a pup still learning the world. Margaret stood at the porch, her scarf tugged by the breeze, watching as the trio disappeared into the stillness of the forest edge. A smile touched her lips, tinged with quiet awe. To her, the sight was proof of resilience, of faith, of the strange ways God chose to mend broken hearts. As Ryan walked, he glanced at the tracks forming behind them. 3 lines of prints etched in snow, side by side. They weren't just walking through a winter morning. They were walking into something new. For the first time since tragedy had fractured his world, Ryan felt whole. He didn't know what the future would bring, whether Faith's scars of the past would ever fade, whether the pup would grow into a steady companion, or whether his own heart would heal completely. But in that moment, with snow crunching beneath his boots and the steady presence of the shepherds at his side, he understood something simple. Storms pass, but the families we build after are what last. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or lightning. They come quietly, in the form of trust, loyalty, and love placed right at our doorstep. Just as Ryan discovered in the snowy silence of Silverpine, God often sends us companions, whether people or animals, not only so we may rescue them, but so they may rescue us in return. In our daily lives, storms will come. Loneliness, loss, or hardship may weigh us down. But God reminds us through moments like these that no storm lasts forever, and that hope often appears in the most unexpected shapes. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone you love. Comment below, tell us where you are watching from, and if you believe God still works miracles today, type Amen in the comments. May the Lord bless you, keep you safe, and remind you every day that you are never alone. And if you would like to see more stories of faith, courage, and love, please subscribe so we can continue this journey together.